Olá a todos que estão nos assistindo. Agora ao vivo é noite no Brasil, mas você pode estar assistindo esse vídeo em qualquer horário na sua casa aí via YouTube. E eu sou Marcelo Cabral, sou o host do nosso canal de entrevistas Entre Mundus, que é o canal de entrevistas da nossa revista chamada Unus Mundus, que parte de uma concepção, de uma visão de que a nossa realidade é ampla, surpreendente, misteriosa, mas, ao mesmo tempo, ela é apta de ser compreendida. Claro, nunca plenamente, mas cada vez mais profundamente. E apesar da realidade ser muito diversa, em seus muitos itens, relações e mecanismos, ela apresenta sinais de uma ordem ou unidade, né? E é fundada nessa visão que nós, da Academia ABC², lançamos a revista Unus Mundus, e tem sido uma grande alegria participar da organização dessa revista, que tem disponibilizado artigos, ensaios, colunas. Para aqueles que têm acompanhado o nosso trabalho, sabem do Radar ABC² e dos vários editais que a gente tem premiado aí, muitos trabalhos que também são publicados na nossa revista Unus Mundus. E esse aqui é o nosso canal de entrevistas, onde nós temos a oportunidade de conversar de maneira honesta e profunda com grandes pensadores e grandes autores na relação entre fé, as ciências e a filosofia. E já faz algum tempo, que nós temos esse novo modelo de entrevistas, onde nós conversamos totalmente em inglês, quando o nosso convidado é inglês, é de fala inglesa, como é a maioria dos casos, né? Por quê? Porque a gente entendeu que, desse modo, a gente utilizaria o nosso tempo do modo mais eficiente, mais profundo, permitindo um diálogo mais franco, mais direto, mais fluido, com mais conteúdo para vocês. E para aqueles que, por um motivo ou outro, não conseguem acompanhar uma conversa em inglês, logo depois que a entrevista ao vivo terminar, isso já vai para a nossa equipe, que nos próximos dias vai legendar, e quando isso subir no nosso canal do YouTube, já vai estar com a legenda em português, e assim você pode compartilhar esse vídeo com seus colegas, seus amigos, né? Todos os canais de contatos, para que esse excelente conteúdo possa atingir o maior número de pessoas. E, gente, nessa noite em especial, nós temos um grande convidado para tratar de um tema importantíssimo. Eu diria que é um tema tão importante quanto é polêmico. Daqui a pouquinho eu já vou apresentá-lo, né? Mas antes, deixa eu falar dos nossos convidados. Temos aqui, como parte da nossa conversa, o querido Saulo Magalhães, que é psicólogo, teólogo e doutor em psicologia social pela UERJ, com muitas especializações, né? Atualmente ele é pesquisador da University of Nations, desenvolvendo várias pesquisas, e é também docente, pesquisador e coordenador do curso de psicologia do Centro Universitário UNA, em Uberlândia, Minas Gerais. Teremos também com nós a Ester, minha amiga de Curitiba, que é formada em psicologia pela UCM, Universidade Complutense de Madrid, e é mestre em psicologia na linha de avaliação e reabilitação neuropsicológica pela Universidade Federal do Paraná. Ela é psicóloga clínica e atua junto com seu marido na coliderança do grupo local da ABC² de Curitiba. Por fim, nós temos como entrevistador o Tiago, aqui famoso da Academia ABC², que é graduado em Teologia pela FTCA, mestre em Ciências da Religião pela PUC Campinas e doutorando em Ciências da Religião pela Universidade Metodista e pela Universidade Livre de Amsterdã. Queridos entrevistadores, obrigado por estarem conosco essa noite, obrigado por aceitarem o convite para esse papo que vai ser tão legal.
Obrigada a vocês.
Um prazer estar aqui.
Muito bom.
E agora, gente... Saulo, obrigado, Ester. E agora, gente, para anunciar o autor, um dos autores, né, porque é um livro de 2 autores, o Paul Moes, desse livraço que a gente publicou, Integrando Psicologia e Fé, Modelos para o Engajamento Cristão. nossa coleção com a Thomas Nelson Brasil. Eu apresento o professor Paul Moes, que é professor no Calvin University, nos Estados Unidos. Ele é formado em psicologia, com doutorado em psicologia experimental, pesquisando sobre a química do comportamento. Sua experiência na docência é marcada por 18 anos de ensino na Dort College e 1 ano na Universidade de St. Andrews, no Reino Unido. Além disso, Moes é autor de vários livros, né? E mais recentemente ele lançou este livraço aqui com Blake Riek, Integrando Psicologia e Fé, Modelos para o Engajamento Cristão, publicado em parceria Thomas Nelson Brasil e ABC². E agora, eu vou switch aqui minha linguagem para o inglês. So, Professor Moes, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a big honor for us to have you this night talking about this complex relationship between faith and psychology.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I'm delighted to be able to share elements from our book, as well as other insights I might be able to have, and also learn from you. I'm sure there's some interesting things that you can share as well.
Amazing. So, as a host, I have the privilege to ask the first question. And this is probably the most philosophical question of our conversation. So here you go. Professor Moes, who are you? By that, I mean, tell us a little bit about your personal journey, both in terms of your faith and in terms of your relationship with this academic discipline of psychology, and maybe some insights of this book, the journey that led you to write this.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I grew up in a home of a pastor. My father was a minister of the Word in the Christian Reformed Church. So I grew up listening to sermons and listening to his teachings. He only died recently at the age of 102. So I was able to learn from him about theology and about faith. So I sat beside him and learned a great deal from him. So that's part of my faith journey. I started out as a biology major and became interested in psychology in college, and then switched over to psychology. I still maintain an interest in biology as well as psychology, so I'm interested in neuroscience and the relationship between brain function and behavior. So I'm not a clinical psychologist. I don't do therapy. As one colleague put it, I have a doctorate, but not the kind that helps people. So, but so my interest in writing this was I taught a course called Psychology and Religion, and we explored a lot of issues, but there wasn't, I didn't think, very good material that really brought together many different issues. Several books were out there that described different models of integration, but they didn't really describe where these came from, what was the background of these people, and why do people come to such different conclusions about psychology. And so my colleague and I set about to write this so that we could present the background. Why do people come to the place they are? So your question is pertinent because you're asking about my background. We want to know the background of others, their theological background, their academic background, and their understanding, their philosophical background, as we understood how they came to the different views that they came to.
Very good. Thank you, Professor. Mm-hmm. Now I invite Professor Saulo, please, to ask his first question.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, Professor Moes, again, to be part of this time together. Mm-hmm. And I will start with the end, because when I read your book, at the conclusion, you encourage the reader to be an agent of transformation in your church. Mm-hmm. So I think with myself, how do you understand the relationship between psychology and local church in the contemporary now?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Psychology has infiltrated much of society. I mean, people have interest in psychological concepts, and they have greater understanding of psychopathology. And so within the church, people are very curious about this, and they still struggle with understanding, if you have the right spirit, if you're in right relationship with God, then how can people have mental illness? How can they struggle with anxiety? How can they have these other difficulties? So I think within the church, it's important for Christian psychologists to speak to those issues, to explain to the average layperson, or as my one colleague calls them, the pew dweller, to understand psychological dysfunction within a church context. I also think we can be a prophetic voice in helping believers understand things like our embodiment. We tend to stress in the church our spiritual relationship with God, but we don't stress much our embodied nature. And to help parishioners understand that we're made of dust. And if they understand that, they realize that we can't always transcend our bodily existence, including our brain function.
Thank you, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's very helpful. Yeah, recently we had also launched a book called The Extended Church. Tiago, help me with the name of the book.
I don't actually remember the English title.
Expanding the Christian mind, right? Like extending the Christian mind, who gets insights from like the extended mind literature and applies to the life of the church, and has this emphasis on the role of the importance of our embodied nature for thinking about our faith.
Is that written by Warren Brown by any chance?
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
It's the Enhancing Christian Life. That's the original title.
Enhancing Christian Life. Thank you.
Warren Brown was just at my house last weekend.
Okay.
Oh, that's amazing.
And he did a presentation at Calvin University. So I'm very familiar with his writings, and he's influenced me quite a bit. So.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, so now please, Esther, you can ask your first question.
Okay. There are some questions between the first one, but Malcolm Jeans was the first author from the psychological area that was part of the Christian Faith and Science book series of Hours Association. How was your experience working with him? How the association between brain function and behavioral neuroscience can increase our knowledge specifically about religious behavior, religious beliefs, and religious experiences, and which are the limitations of neurotheology?
Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack there. Those are good questions. First of all, my relationship with Malcolm Jeans was wonderful. I spent a great deal of time with him for a year doing research, but we also spent many hours over tea discussing theology and many of those questions you just raised. So those were wonderful experiences, and I've gained a great deal of insights from him. In terms of the relationship to brain function to theology, Professor Jeeves has written about that as well. And I think it's really a tricky issue, because I do believe that we are material substance, but our belief is ultimately magical. I mean, it is not explainable by physical substance, clearly. But that exact relationship is difficult then for us to appreciate. I do understand, however, that the knowledge we gain, not our saving belief, but our knowledge is gained through the normal means. We gain knowledge about God the same way we gain knowledge about the physical world, for example. We learn in Sunday school, and we learn all kinds of ways, and those things are implanted in our brains. Everything we learn changes our brain structure and our brain function. So our religious experience is also neurological in that sense. We are embodied individuals And because of that, what we learn about God, what we learn about salvation, is part of our makeup. I've also been influenced a lot by Jamie Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with Jamie Smith. He's another professor at Calvin. And he talks a lot about our religious practice, our physical experiences, bowing our heads, folding our hands, kneeling, other practices that we do, engaging in being of service to others. Those physical activities strengthen our faith. They bring us closer to God in the actions, and they become part of us. They become ingrained in our physical nature. So I think our religious belief, the ultimate act of belief, is miraculous and mysterious, but much of our strengthening of belief is neurological and physical. There was one other part of your question. I can't remember the other part.
Which are the limitations of neurotheology?
Yeah, I think there are limitations. As I said, it is a miraculous nature, something that cannot be accounted for by science. My belief cannot be explained fully. Although I do believe that you could probably do brain scans of believers and you might see some significant differences. I don't know. Just because we are always changed by the nature of our thoughts, and the nature of our beliefs change us in significant ways. And I also have seen people who are believers who have significant brain injury, and I've worked with patients like that, and they sometimes struggle with their faith. I believe that God can hold on to them even in their disability, but their belief and their understanding has been changed because of their injury.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Professor. Now, Tiago, please, you can ask your first question.
Okay, so Professor, I think this interview can be a great opportunity to clarify some of your goals in the book that you co-author with Professor Blake. And starting by the title, I think my first question will be whether you think that it's desirable to actually integrate psychology and faith. Isn't the use of this same term more close to what the people from Christian counseling does? That is to make psychology and Christian faith one single thing, and kind of like submitting faith to psychology and psychology to faith. So how does your proposal kind of like differentiate between this another approach?
That's a great question, and it's something we struggled with quite a bit. The title is, in fact, developed by the publisher, but we had the opportunity to edit it. So some of it had to do with simple marketing. Integration is a term that many people just understand. They recognize that terminology. But we also recognize that, we're trying to present different models, and some of the models we're presenting don't really address or don't buy into significant integration. They try to keep faith separate from psychology and science. So you're right. I mean, we are tipping our hand a little bit, showing that we do favor some models more than others, but we do try to present them fairly. And again, it was mostly a term that I think was recognizable. I think if I had to do it over again, I would have picked a different one, but we're stuck with that now.
Yes, I understand. It's challenging to find the right title. Yeah, but I think you made a good job like differentiating the Bible counseling approach from those who you call integrative approaches, like territorialism and perspectivism, right? So I think that's
and those
good.
are really subtly different. At times it was hard to distinguish them because they're only shades different in some ways. And some people who we characterized as perspectivalists, I think, might say, I'm not sure I'm that at all.
Yeah, I can imagine but I think it's a very important job to try to give names to these different ways to understand and approach the relationship. Yeah. Good. So now my second question. in the last chapter before the conclusion, that at least in Portuguese is called humanizers of science. Is that right? Humanizers of science. I had a feeling reading this chapter that is in some ways this approach, it's near to contemporary psychoanalysis claim. Let me try to quickly explain and hear about you. So here in Brazil, recently there was this book that was launched by two important authors. They both are Brazilian, but one of them lives in the USA. And it's a very positivist book towards science. Right? So they try to dismantle the called pseudosciences. And among the pseudosciences, they pick psychoanalysis as a classical way. And as you can imagine, that triggered a huge discussion and a fierce discussion, because many psychologists in Brazil are still very influenced by psychoanalysis traditions. And among this debate, there was this idea from the psychoanalysis that we cannot see the human being and the psychology as merely another kind of natural science, because we are dealing with human beings who are different in kind from natural objects. And so although the so-called humanizers of science who propose a kind of Christian psychology may differ a great deal in their worldview from psychoanalysts, I smell a kind of shared view on this, that we need to see psychology as not another kind of natural science. So how do you see, do you feel in the same way, or you see this comparison is problematic?
I know many people. Elizabeth Lewis Hall comes to mind as a person that I think fits in this category. She actually came and spoke in my class, and she would, I think, identify with that position. And I respect her a great deal. So I have a great deal of respect for several individuals within this field. Of course, I come from a very strong science background. I came out as a biology major initially and switched to psychology. So I have a strong feel for science. And in my early part of my career, I took a dim view of anything that wasn't very strong science. I wasn't a strict positivist, but I leaned more toward a post-positive, but strong science emphasis. Surprisingly, neuroscience showed me a new way of thinking. You wouldn't think it would come from neuroscience, but studying cases of people with brain injury or with neurological deficits taught me there's something phenomenological that cannot be reduced down to simple variables, simple conditions. Those things are important to study sometimes. You want to study simple relationships, but if you want to see the totality of human thinking. So Warren Brown talks about emergent property, the idea that out of this complex interaction emerges something truly unique and truly human that can't be reduced down to the component elements. So I think one of the things the humanizers of psychology recognize is that, well, they don't deny science, by the way. They're not opposed to science, but they recognize that you cannot explain all phenomenon of human behavior and human thought cannot be reduced down to those variables. So I value that. One criticism of the humanistic or humanizer approach is that they have a hard time identifying, well, exactly how then, what are the limits? In what ways do we use science in understanding human behavior? In what ways do we not? And how would theories be very specifically different using that approach, especially if you think about Christian theology? What are the specific ways it would be unique compared to previous therapies or ideas? So I respect a great deal, but I think they have a ways to go to flesh out how this actually works out, how you actually implement specific therapies that are unique and really capture that unique human quality.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Professor. And now I invite Professor Saulo, please, to ask his second question.
Okay. Let me invite you, Professor, to travel through philosophy now.
Okay.
And
good. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm used in philosophy.
I think of myself about now Soren Kierkegaard or Martin Heidegger and the existentialism. So what do you think when we put in your book about, in chapter 3, I remember, you put some type of psychologists and clinical psychologists, and when we think about the logotherapy or existentialism psychology in Rollo May, what do you think the idea of these authors, in special when you considerate the influence of philosophy, existentialism? And I think about the concept of meaning of life in logotherapy. And when I put between your title of the book, Integrate Psychology and Faith, what do you think about all these pieces of puzzles?
Well, one thing I think that is truly unique about human nature that can't be accounted for by simple biological phenomenon or reduced down to other phenomenon is the idea that we are meaning-seeking creatures. I think we are endowed by our Maker to seek an understanding. Even some psychologists, secular psychologists, talked about the fact that we seek after a higher being, that it's a strong human inclination to try and explain not only the immediate reality that we experience, but a larger reality. Why do things exist? Why do I exist? And so we are very much meaning-seeking creatures. And from a very early age, we're constantly asking why. And young children want to understand, how the universe works. Why does it rain? Well, gods must be crying. They seek meaning for things all the time. And I think that that's something that logotherapy stresses, is our meaning-seeking nature. And several philosophers of psychology have noted how important it is for psychotherapy to not only change our behavior, but to change our meaning. And that can have a powerful influence on our direction. Sometimes individuals need to change their behavior first, and then their meaning falls into place. Other people need to change their meaning. They need to change their orientation. And some people just have no meaning. They're meaningless. A lot of studies have shown that people who commit suicide, oftentimes they feel adrift. They feel they have no meaning or purpose. And so I think that's a big part of our human nature that cannot be reduced. I hope that addresses what you're asking.
Good.
Yes, that makes sense. Yes, makes sense. And about Rollo May, what do you think? Because when I think about Rollo May, it's interesting to consider your thought about the freedom, about the responsibility through the life. So what do you think about his thought in existentialism psychology?
Well, it's been a long time since I read Rollo May, so forgive me if I'm a little rusty on that. So I'm not a clinical psychologist. I had a good friend who was very much steeped in that tradition, so I learned from him, but it's been a while since I really delved into that. But I think that, in terms of taking responsibility and accountability, that's another thing, another book that I wrote with another co-author. We talk about several biblical themes of human nature. One of them is that we're meaning-seeking creatures. The other is that we're limited agents. So we have limitations based on our social setting. We have limitations based on our brain structure and our bodily existence. But we also are agents, agents that are capable of taking accountability. And that accountability varies. It's on a continuum in some respects. People with severe brain injury have less accountability. Those of us who have intact brains, hopefully still, probably have more. So I think people can take accountability. It's important in therapy to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Thank you. And now I invite Esther, please, to ask her second question.
I love the final questions at the end of every chapter. The activities that you suggest that we can do to understand where I am and what can I do. But I would like to ask you a last word for researchers, professors, and students. Which areas of psychology of religion do you think that need to be more explored nowadays? How to prepare yourself for teaching about that subject in a sometimes unwelcoming space as a university, and how to face the conflict and dilemmas, maintaining integrity and respecting others while studying psychology?
Mm-hmm. Boy, there's so many areas. It's hard to pin down one. Let me talk about one that I think is very challenging, is evolutionary psychology. I think within that field, there are actually some very interesting ideas about, again, because it emphasizes our embodiment, and that behavior is sometimes related to our natural environment. Why do we behave in certain ways? It's part, we're endowed with certain qualities to help us survive. And it's no stretch as a Christian to say, well, we were endowed by our Maker to have those qualities for our survival. That's part of our existence. So I think there's many good ideas, but there's also many challenges. Also in terms of their use of science. So I critique evolutionary psychology both on their implications, but also their sort of circular reasoning and misuse in some ways of scientific theory. So I think there's both good and bad there. I think Christians need to be able and willing to tackle head on those complex issues. I don't think we should shy away from them at all. Explore them in depth. There's several great authors who have done that. Heather Loy comes to mind as an author who has explored evolutionary psychology principles, especially related to gender differences. And she has some really interesting insights about both what's positive from evolutionary psychology, but also some real negatives and some alternative ways of thinking about it. So I think that's one challenging area. I think another real positive area is in the area of positive psychology, a movement that focuses on not just our disability and our dysfunction, but on positive qualities. And so I just had dinner the other night with Dave Myers, who's written quite a bit, and he's good friends with Martin Seligman, who's big in the movement of positive psychology. And I think there's much to explore that's really beneficial. I think it aligns well with other movements in psychology. And I think it's a positive force that people of faith can embrace. Not that everything there is also perfect, but I think there's much to learn about the qualities that we are motivated to do that go beyond mere survival. And positive psychologists, I think, have really been the cutting edge of that movement. So I think that's something that Christians should really explore and not necessarily embrace wholeheartedly, but certainly examine carefully.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tiago, please, your second question.
Okay, so Professor, the second question is more personal, if you don't mind. I think, well, I was wondering, at what point in your life did you feel the necessity to relate psychology to your Christian faith? I mean, a lot of psychology students, they don't feel like this necessity at all to make sense of their faith in the midst of their studies in psychology. So when this just click up on you and you decided to integrate in a way your studies with your faith, and do you have any advices for the students that will be listening to us here?
That's a good question, because I came to psychology late in my academic upbringing. So I started out in biology, and I took a good course. I went to a Christian college, and I took a course on evolutionary principles in a Christian college, and we explored a lot of those issues, and we applied our faith to those issues. And that really taught me to how to deal with complex issues, how to deal with scripture, how do we try to relate these things. So when I went to psychology, when I was in graduate school, of course, I was at a secular university, and there was no reference to faith. It was downplayed at every turn. So it was a struggle very much on your own to try and understand, how do I relate these things? I remember studying in particular cognitive theories of learning. And surprisingly, it was in that area where it really struck me, the old behaviorist theories had kind of melted away. There were new cognitive theories. And I began to explore then, in what ways are these compatible or not compatible with a sense of agency, with a sense of meaning on some of those issues. And I didn't have the answers. I still don't have all the answers, but I really began to explore, how do these relate? I think it was in that class that I took in graduate school that really struck me about thinking about, well, do I have responsibility for the nature of my learning? Or am I just a passive recipient of experience? And so that really struck me. And then I think from my background in the Reformed tradition that I'm from, exploring faith and science was always been in my DNA. It's always been part of my background. And so I think from the get-go, when I started teaching, I struggled. I certainly didn't have as clear of an understanding of that relationship when I started. So I think in answer to your question, what advice do I have, is simply begin the struggle. Don't take pat answers for granted. Explore ways that you think about the meaning of our existence. Think about basic principles about human nature. What are we about? What are some assumptions that you have about our human nature? And that then you can begin to relate to various scientific explorations or therapeutic applications. How do these comport? How do they match with my basic understanding of human nature?
Thank you very much, Marcelo. If I may, I just have a follow-up question. So Professor,
okay, please.
Thank you very much for your generosity. So, Professor Moes, I was wondering here, hearing your answer, do you feel that it's important to at least have a basic theological background as a Christian student in psychology? Well, I mean, you had a background because of your Reformed church during your childhood and you growing up, but I think that's not necessarily what a lot of people have, because they don't have a lot of information about their own faith. So where do those people can begin starting to understand a theology, or at least a basic theology, to deal with their psychology studies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We struggled that. I wrote another book with a co-author that was for an introductory class. And we have a lot of students at our university. Most of them are Christian, but we discovered that a lot of them didn't have as deep a Bible knowledge as we thought they should, or as deep a knowledge of theology as we thought they should. So we had to insert some things in that book already, some basic principles of theology, about sin, salvation, those fundamental concepts. So at least in that book, we thought we'll need to provide some remedial help for students who have limited background. So you're right. I think it's very important to have at least foundational knowledge. I don't think students have to be experts in all theology or experts even in scripture. They need to know those foundational principles that relate to the Christian faith. Those obviously grow from our church community and our church fellowship. Going to mentors, I went to my dad, but there can be other mentors that you can find who can guide you, both Christian psychologists. So I learned a great deal from Malcolm Jeeves, who's not a theologian, but he really was very understanding of a lot of faith perspectives and ideas. So I learned from other people like that, colleagues, other students when I was a student. Go to them, have conversations about theology. I learned a great deal from students who were preparing for the seminary. I learned a great deal of philosophy and theology just by talking to them. So wherever you can find it, I guess, is the answer. But you do need to have those foundational principles, because otherwise you're not sure what you're relating to, or what principles come to bear in thinking about psychology.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. I think your answers to Tiago's questions apply to other fields beyond psychology when you think of the relationship of any discipline with religion, with the Christian faith, right? Like the ability to live with issues unsolved. Don't get petty answers or easy roads, right? And also your the way that you emphasize the importance to have some biblical literacy and theological understanding if you want to make a meaningful relationship between psychology or any other discipline with faith, right? And
if I could just follow up actually with one example of a struggle that I still have. Yeah. So as I said, I don't have all the answers. But one thing I struggle a great deal with is the notion of original sin or just sin in general, and the relationship of psychological principles to that. So I have a colleague who teaches lifespan development. She talks about children. And if you see a 2-year-old throwing a temper tantrum, is that an example of our original sin, or is that just a psychological concept? Can you explain this based on their brain development and their background, their parenting? Which of those accounts for that? So that's a great struggle for me, quite honestly. I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. I've talked to colleagues about it. In fact, one colleague has actually written about that a fair amount. And my answer to her often is, in the end, I don't know. In the end, I can't account for it other than that sin perhaps is woven into the fabric of our life. It's not an add-on. It's part of our social fabric. It's part of our mental fabric. It's not an infection from the outside. It's part of what we are. That's the best I can answer. So that, I think I gave that example because for students struggling with how do you relate faith principles to your discipline, you don't always have to have all the immediate answers, but struggling to try and understand those things, to put those together. And that's what makes me feel more satisfied. At least I want the whole of reality to fit together. I want the pieces of my life to fit together. I don't want to have disjointed ideas, religion over on one corner and science on another corner and psychology in another corner. I want to have these ideas as best I can integrated.
That's very, very good. Thank you, Professor. Now we have a time for final questions. So, Saulo, do you have any final question to ask?
Yes, just a simple question. During all this discussion is growing my mind, the approach. When we think about clinical psychologists, we think about some approach for this. And what do you think when we consider a Christian psychology clinic approach? It makes sense for you? Because when I think this in Brazil, it's like a craziness for us in Brazil. Not for me, but for my class in Brazil. So I really want to, I'm so curious to listen to you about this in the US. When you think like Eric Johnson in his books developed, what do you think?
Well, I think it depends on what circle you're in, and the context matters a great deal. We've talked about that in my class. If you're doing therapy in a church-related counseling center, it's a very easy matter. I mean, well, it's not easy, but it flows more naturally. And your clients are, for the most part, Christians or people of faith, struggling with faith, perhaps. And so it's a much different matter than at a secular course or university on neuroscience. So, yeah, you wouldn't be able to do that there. And in a counseling center or a clinical setting where the person is not a person of faith, you can still apply your principles about agency and about meaning seeking and about accountability. But you can't obviously just proselytize in every situation. It may be actually counterproductive to try and evangelize in that situation. You can bring healing, though, in a variety of ways by using those fundamental principles, I think, that would apply in all situations. So I think context matters a great deal. Now, there's some tricky issues when you have people violating moral principles, and exactly how you handle that. I'm thankful I'm not a therapist then in those situations, because they get to be tricky.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Very good. So, Esther, do you have a final question to ask, please?
Yes. With the recent release of Inside Out 2 in Brazil, the film has been target of criticism for some Christians that see in the movie an excessive importance given to emotions for reaching well-being to the detriment of other dimensions. Do you think that there is conflict between psychology and Christianity here, in your opinion? And how the recent discoveries of the neuroscience of emotions could impact our Christian comprehension of, for example, parenthood or building emotionally healthy communities, for example, and how our Christian worldview could feel, for example, the role of emotions in the understanding of human being?
Well, that's a great question. And I've explored that a lot with my students. The history of both within the Christian community and in the scientific community of downplaying emotions. There's been a long history of that, going back to Descartes already, the philosopher who wanted to separate emotions from rational thought. They existed in two worlds. And one of my favorite books that I've read over the last 30 years is by Antonio Damasio, entitled Descartes' Error, talking about the need for emotion in making basic human judgments. I think the Christian community has also downplayed emotions. Particularly in my tradition, in the Reformed tradition, there has been a lot of emphasis on cognition, on understanding theology. Action was secondary. As long as you have your theology right, everything else falls into place. Emotions were not central to that in many ways. So I think a more holistic view does emphasize the need for emotional intelligence, for emotional expression. And it's part of our relational nature. That's the other theme in our other book, is that we are relational, and emotions are central to our relational nature. In reading people, in understanding, and be able to really empathize. And even our moral principles. Morality is, in some respects, an emotional quality, because we can empathize and we can be helpful and promote justice because we have emotions. And so I think it's important for the Christian community to recognize our need for emotions. I mean, I can maybe understand that the movie like Inside Out 2 might emphasize it too much. The pendulum can swing too far the other way, where, rational thought is thrown out the window too. We need both. But I think the tradition has been in the Christian community to downplay emotions too much. And we need a balance and more holistic view.
Thank you.
Very good, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
So usually by the end of our interviews, we ask quick, kind of personal and funny questions to our invitees.
Okay.
So my first question is, do you have recommendations of books that you like, but it cannot be theological, philosophical, or psychological books? It can be literature, poetry, or another genre that you personally like, books that you enjoy reading?
Oh boy, I really enjoy history.
Okay.
I love to read about American presidents. Of course, in Brazil, maybe that wouldn't be as popular, but Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, George Washington, Hamilton. So a lot of historical figures. That's one of my favorite things. I love to read about science and books about cosmology. My father was very much into that, so he was really interested in astronomy and cosmology. So I've read several books on that. A book that I just finished was sort of different. It's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, the woman whose cells were harvested from her cancer and were used in medical treatment for years. It's just an interesting story historically about racism, about justice, but also medical issues, ethics. So it combines a lot of interesting exploration. So I'm also the head of our institutional review board to review scientific studies.
Wow.
And that book was very helpful because one of the reasons we have institutional review boards is because of situations like hers, where people abused scientific explorations and abused people along the way. So those are a few of my non-religious books.
No. Very good. I'm curious about this last one.
Mm-hmm.
So another question. What's your favorite thing about Grand Rapids?
Okay. Well, right now it's the colors. It's in the fall season, the autumn, and we have the most spectacular leaves that you could imagine right now. There's oranges and reds, and so that's one of my favorite things. Also, the beautiful lakes that we have, Lake Michigan and surrounding lakes. We own a small cottage, so we love to spend time doing a little fishing and spending time on the water. The scenery is gorgeous there, so I love the water and the natural beauty here.
Okay, now my final question. Who will win the World Series? The Dodgers or the Yankees?
Well, I hosted Warren Brown at my house, as I mentioned, and he's from the Los Angeles area. He would be very upset if I said anything but the Dodgers. So he's a huge Dodgers fan, and I think by relation with him, I now favor the Dodgers. And in part because I hate the Yankees. So,
me too.
Yeah. So that's my pick, or that's my hope.
I'm glad. I'm a Dodgers fan as well. Tomorrow's a big day.
Yeah, it is.
So thank you very much, Professor Moes, for your generosity, for your intelligence, for your time talking with us, answering our questions. It was really a privilege for us, and I'm sure for all of our audience.
Great.
Thank you very much.
You had some great questions, so I really appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saulo, Ester, and Tiago, for your great questions, for your time this night. E, pessoal, assim nós terminamos a nossa entrevista com o grande Paul Moes, um dos autores desse importante livro recém-lançado, Integrando Psicologia e Fé, Modelos para o Engajamento Cristão. Fica super dica aí para vocês. Com isso, nos despedimos e até a próxima.
Bye-bye.